Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session. We'll give it another 30 seconds, 1 minute or so, and then we'll get going. It's such beautiful weather today, so hopefully everyone's got their margaritas ready to go for this lunchtime webinar. And then we'll get started in 30 seconds or so. I see quite a few people joining, which is amazing. Welcome if you've just joined. Welcome to the session. We've got a few more and then we'll get started. I think actually we'll get started now. I think everyone's sunny, beautiful day. We've got an amazing webinar today on consumer duty. We've been talking a lot about consumer duty, but we've got some new deadlines coming up that we all need to be aware of. So hopefully, like I said, margaritas at the ready. We've got 45 minutes and some amazing speakers today to talk through this topic. So I'm Jessica Cath. I'm the head of financial crime here at Thistle. I'm going to be the moderator today, and today we're going to be talking about mastering the upcoming FCA Consumer Duty deadline. We have a lot of amazing speakers here, so I am just moderating this. I do everything fin crime, AML, sanctions, fraud, ABC, but we're not talking about any of that today. We're talking about consumer duty stuff. So let's just go around a couple of 30 seconds, 1 minute intro. Let's start with Lorraine. Do you want to do an intro to yourself?
I do indeed. Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lorraine Moat. I'm Head of Payment Services here at Thistle Initiatives. So I look after all the clients that fall into sort of electronic money institution or payment institution sector.
Perfect. Thank you. That was nice and snappy. Well done. We're just 1 minute in and we're making good progress, which is good. So Matt, on to you next.
Yeah, I'll try and keep mine snappy as well. So hi guys, Matt Williamson, head of credit and mortgages here at Thistle. So anything in the credit and mortgages space I deal with. I also deal with insurance clients as well.
Perfect. You've got a huge range there, which is pretty good. Cool. Yeah. On to Paul then, an intro from your side.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Kane. I'm head of the retail division at Thistle. I've been with the firm for about 7 years now, and seen a lot of issues around compliance issues, such as obviously the implementation of consumer duty. Types of firm that we typically deal with is IFAs, wealth managers, DFMs, mortgage brokers, and general insurance firms. And I'm going to be looking at consumer duty implementation in the scope of retail investment firms.
Perfect. I bet you've seen some stories. We can maybe catch up on those later. Last but not least, Karishma.
Thanks, Jess. My name's Karishma Galea, and I'm a senior manager in the wholesale investments team. Prior to joining Thistle, I was in-house in the compliance function at an asset management platform firm for many years.
Our stories there as well, I'm sure. All right, so I'll do a super brief intro to Thistle. So we are a specialist governance, risk and compliance consultancy. We've been going for just over 10 years now. So we've got a whole wealth of experience across all of our compliance and financial crime consultants, doing a hell of a lot of work from authorizations to advice, support, and the whole breadth of regulated financial services firms and others as well. So yeah, we help and support with lots of changing regulations, which is very tricky to keep up to date with. So we are, of course, here to help. So what we're going to be talking about today, we have 3 key areas for this 45-minute session. We will start by talking through board report submission. So really breaking down the essential components that you need to have within that board report. And we're going to try and pull out some really interesting key best practice tips. So we want you to walk away today with some tips and tricks to make sure you are meeting the FCA standards and the expectations around the board report. Then we're going to go on to the closed products deadline. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the implications of the closed products coming into scope and what this means. as well as some strategies on managing and reporting on these. So again, hopefully some really clear takeaways for you on strategies and how to deal with it. And then we're going to spend the final third of the session looking at an interactive Q&A. So it's amazing. We've had a load of questions for people that have signed up to this webinar already. And they're a really great set of questions. And then, of course, please use the Q&A function as well. We will be picking up on any questions as part of the session, and we'll either answer them live or we'll get back to you after the session. So hopefully that will be useful as well. So we've got 45 minutes, around 15 minutes for each of these. So that's enough from me. I think we'll get started and we'll start talking about the board report submission. So now we've got rid of our slides, you can see all of our lovely faces and we'll get started on the conversation. So Lorraine, can you just set the scene a little bit for us? So what is the board report submission and why is it important?
Okay, yeah, I think that's a really important point to make, is really just to set that scene and understand really what the FCA's ultimate goal here. And the ultimate goal really from the Consumer Duty framework is it's really seeking to emphasise that need for firms to act in the best interest of their customers. Of course, we all know that, but one of the key components in achieving that is effective governance. So let's kind of just explore that little idea of governance by way of background a little further, because I think it's actually really important, but it's quite often overlooked as quite a key element of the Consumer Duty. So what the FCA recognise is that real change will really only come about if the boards of the regulated firms are fully bought into the need for that change. And while the new rules and the new Principle 12 form part of that solution, the FCA has realised that more was actually needed for firms to consistently meet that high expectation. And the board report therefore sort of builds on the idea of accountability focused on board members. And that board reporting generally is a very important key component of governance anyway. So board reporting is a big part of any type of governance in a business. So I think the board report is really expected to play a pivotal role in making sure that or enabling senior managers to stay informed about critical issues, assess performance against objectives, and importantly, it really helps firms make informed decisions that impact customer outcomes for the positive. And I think as such, these comprehensive reports to the board are going to ensure that senior management is fully informed about just how the firm is meeting its consumer duty obligation. So that's a kind of snapshot of really what it's about and what it's trying to achieve in a bit of a nutshell.
Yeah, I know you spend a lot of time really talking to clients about the importance of governance, and do not overlook it. Don't get into the weeds without considering the governance structure and what exactly is going up to the board through this report. So it's something that's often overlooked.
Yeah, agreed.
So it's without overlooking it then, we now need to explore what goes into this report. And Matt, could you just give us a little bit of a sense of what elements need to feed into that report?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I think just to reiterate, the overarching aim of the board report is to provide that assessment to the governing body so that they can determine whether good outcomes or agree to whether good outcomes have been achieved over the preceding year. So the assessment needs to include, and this is a bit of a theme of today, but the assessment really needs to include MI and the results of the monitoring undertaken. So whether the products and services are delivering the expected outcomes. I think any evidence then of poor customer outcomes being experienced will then need to be detailed in that report. And then where those outcomes have been identified, really we should be looking at doing a root cause analysis assessment and then detailing the results of those in the board pack. So when that's then presented to the governing body, they'll need to agree on those, effectively the assessment undertaken, as well as any proposed recommendations or enhancements that need to be made if poor outcomes have been identified, and then agree even if future strategy needs to be changed or products or services need to be revamped given those outcomes. So sort of a high level overview. And I think then if we really boil it down, so practically speaking, what are we including in our board packs? What are we expecting to see? And I think we can sort of broadly break it down into a few subheadings. So the first subheadings sort of focused on governance, strategy, and policies. So has consumer duty and good customer outcomes been reflected in the strategies and the governance, the leadership, people policies? Example might be, are staff incentives appropriate? So really trying to look at it from the governance perspective and building on what Lorraine has said. Then we can look at it from the cost-cutting perspective and the cost-cutting rules. So have we acted in good faith? Have we avoided causing consumer harm? And then I think breaking it down then specifically against the 4 consumer duty outcomes. So you've got products and services. Is the design appropriate? Does it meet the needs of the target market? Is it being distributed appropriately? Is it being manufactured appropriately? So all of that needs to be considered. Price and value. So is the price appropriate? Is value still being provided as it was originally intended? Has the fair price and value assessment been revamped as well? So it's another key consideration. You're going to do the same exercise with consumer understanding, consumer support as well, and then I'd also suggest having a vulnerable customer section there as well, just given it's such a central tenet to all of the aspects of consumer duty, and again cuts across all of the outcomes. And then once all of that's been compiled, you've got all of that in there. I think an assessment summary at the bottom, which kind of details what those findings are, and then that's obviously presented and then hopefully agreed, with not too many poor outcomes identified by the governing body. So I think in a nutshell, that's sort of the key elements, and that's what we would expect to see in a board report.
That is really useful. All of those, I hope everyone had pen and paper at the ready, because those are really, really practical, basically outlining the whole subheadings that firms will need. So that was really, really useful. In the vein of practical, useful things, Paul, you've got a load of best practice tips that you're talking to with firms all the time. So what do you think? What would be the tips to maybe add on to what Matt's saying?
Yeah, I think it's the first thing is to ensure that the report has a clear structure. It might sound pretty simple, but we expect that the FCA might ask firms for their board report at some point. So being able to clearly outline how you've demonstrated good outcomes for clients is going to be really important. And obviously talking about following the headings that Matt's just mentioned. So having a clear structure and covering all the key elements is important. Not treating it like a tick box exercise. The FCA on multiple occasions has said consumer duty and the board report is not a tick box exercise. It's not a once and done exercise. So effectively, firms have got to be able to evidence in their annual report that they're continuously learning and continuously improving. So that would be my second tip. Again, coming back to data, it's going to have to be data driven. So we would expect that firms are including quite a bit of data within that to evidence good outcomes, but also to evidence poor outcomes. We suggest that firms evidence both good and poor customer outcomes, because it's reasonable to expect that not every firm is getting everything right. So effectively being able to say we could do this better is fine, but and we would encourage that, but then you've got to have something like an action plan in place. So for example, if a firm just is putting, yes, we're doing fantastic things for customers, and no customers are, there's no poor outcomes at all, that's likely to be unrealistic. And the final point is to get wider opinion. So you may want to get your consumer duty champions input into this. Another thing is to possibly poll wider staff, because staff may well have their own views on how consumer duty is going within the firm.
Those are some really useful points. I like point one, make sure it's simple and clear. And I can see that Lorraine's come off mute here. She's desperate to add in some more tips into the conversation as well.
Absolutely. I want to just pick up very quickly on something that Paul just said there, which I think is absolutely spot on. This idea of I used to be a head of compliance in my past life, and if I've ever looked at a dashboard and seen a sea of green, it's always made me very nervous, because business carries risk, and that's a fact. So the idea that maybe there are things in your business that you could do better, I think it's fine that you've at least acknowledged or identified those. It's not necessary that you're doing everything perfectly. It's all about how you're managing and identifying where you can improve. But I just want to add a few other things to sort of develop a little bit of what Paul said. And I think for me, the first step when you're looking at this is to look at and identify those relevant roles and responsibilities. You know, who's going to be responsible for doing what as part of this process. And they really need to be allocated, you know, accordingly. I would also suggest that you make sure that you also include all lines of defence, so that's including the second and the third line of defence, just to make sure that all those monitoring activities are actually included and considered, but also just to make sure there's a degree of independence in the process. Another thing that Paul's just mentioned there is about, you know, who is involved in that stakeholder input. I think it's really, really important to incorporate feedback from various stakeholders, you know, whether that's compliance officers, your customer services team, but don't forget some insight that you might get from things like internal, external audits, because that's good data that you can also use to your benefit in many ways. We also mentioned there about evidencing poor outcomes, so what's not just going good, but what maybe hasn't gone so well. And I think when you're looking at that, think to include whether there's any particular group or cohort of customers that may be receiving worse outcomes compared to another group, because I think that's quite a good kind of comparison to make. And also don't forget an evaluation of the impact and the root cause of any issues that you find. But when you do so, there's obviously got to be actions off the back of that. So adding an overview of any actionable insights that there might be. So what steps the business going to take or has taken to address any of those risks or issues. And again, pointing to something Matt said previously about vulnerability, particularly to highlight those measures taken to identify, support your vulnerable customers, just ensuring that you can evidence they're not necessarily disadvantaged. But one final piece of advice to me would be to just make sure that the board is kept up to date. So, you know, engage the board early to be sure of making sure you're going to meet that initial deadline for the board report. Then board's going to have reviewed and discussed and chewed over that report prior to them actually being able to approve it. And that would be including agreeing to any actions, of course, to address any poor customer outcomes, proposed changes, which you might have to make, of course, to your business strategy in light of any results that you're seeing. So I guess my question, or my point would be to you, you know, is your board going to just be seeing that for the first time when you're asking them to approve it? Because if so, that's a mistake. Make sure they see it early so that any changes can be agreed and formalised just before that absolute, the final sort of deadline. So yeah, just wanted to add that in, thanks.
No, those are super useful points and kind of wraps back to what Paul was saying and the importance of the actions and making sure everything is captured clearly. Karishma, again, you've come off mute as well. There's more practical tips I know from you as well. So have you got anything else to add on this one?
I do. Thanks, Jess. I think having worked in-house previous to joining Thistle, having been part of the project implementing the Consumer Duty, I do have to say I have full empathy with the teams pulling this together and including all the elements that my colleagues have set out earlier. On a practical level, it is hard to do in the timeframes that firms work on a typical basis, on top of their BAU. So my advice would be to look at the board report through a practical lens as a decision-making document and tool, and not just putting it together and discussing it like Lorraine said, you know, once a year and then forgetting about it in between. The board consumer champion should really be able to support in this regard, as they should know what level of information will work for the board and be most effective. From a practical perspective as well, I also like to think about the 3 sites that is sometimes spoken about in terms of governance. So these are insight, oversight, and foresight. So does your document allow you as board to have these 3 sites in terms of what is happening within the business? In terms of oversight, to reiterate what my colleagues have said, the board report has to offer the board information across the business in relation to the full range of your products and services, including frontline monitoring results and KPIs, which is particularly relevant to maybe the larger institutions. This information can provide very deep insight for the board as to what is happening at the front line, so to speak, against the 4 Consumer Duty outcomes. We tend to see monitoring results from the second and third line, so many firms are thinking about having compliance monitoring, internal audit reports and results reported, which is great, but maybe not so much from the first line. In addition, I would add the importance of positive outcomes. I know we've spoken a bit about this already, but I do want to add that it's really important as well. A lot of emphasis is placed on where outcomes are not being met, but it's also important for boards to know and have a really good understanding of what is working well and why. Finally, I think the report needs to provide enough information to inform or support decision-making by the board. And this includes both tactical decisions and strategic decisions going forward, which of course is the foresight element. So making these decisions on whether to improve or shut down products or services, etc. And this is very relevant to the closed products review, of course.
Perfect. Which, I mean, that pretty much leads us on to the closed products piece. But before we do that, it sounds like keep it simple. This is a practical document for decision making. It's not a tick box, and make sure you've got good data and MI flowing into this report. So hopefully there's been some really good takeaways for everyone on that section. But looking at the time, we're 20 minutes in instead of 15, but that's not too bad. We'll move on then to the closed products deadline. So Lorraine, back to you, our master of setting the scene here. What's the background to this one?
Thank you. Yes, seem to be the scene-setting queen today. Absolutely. So let me just, first of all, talk about what is a closed product. So closed products are basically financial products that are no longer available for sale to new customers, but they may continue to still be held by your existing customers. So if I maybe look at that from the point of view of the payment sector, which is my sector, of course, that might include something like outdated payment cards, old service plans, legacy payment processing agreements, for example. So it's important that obviously within your business, you first of all identify what are your closed products. But when it comes to closed products, you as a firm are going to have to really carefully manage those offerings just to ensure that they continue to deliver the same sort of level or the same expectations as your current product. So that could be fair value, looking at your good customer outcomes, just to be in line with the duty. It may also be things like appropriate communications, support and guidance as just examples. So it is basically just looking at those products that are no longer available for sale from your business, but that are still a product that a customer is still using at this moment in time.
Perfect. That was a really good setting scene and a bit of a summary. To then start bringing this down and start looking at some examples in more detail, I think, Matt, could you maybe take us through of examples of how Consumer Duty might then be implemented in these closed products?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I just want to again reiterate what Lorraine said. Really good point is that they are closed products, but Consumer Duty absolutely still applies. We need to be looking at it with that lens. So if we take a practical example, and let's just a generic firm decides to wind down a specific product, so not winding down as a business in its entirety, they're still offering other products. It's just a specific product line that they want to wind down. It therefore becomes the closed product. The firm will then still need to ensure that they're effectively monitoring the customer's activity and engagement, the outcomes associated with that as well. So some of that monitoring might include customer response times. So how quickly are our customer services and other staff responding to requests, questions, complaints, inquiries, and then actually then looking at those response times versus the other products that we have. Is there a discrepancy between the two, or are we actually operating as we should do despite it being a closed product? So are there any considerations that we need to look at across products? I think if we take the same sort of train of thought there and we say, are there any specific complaints as well that are are being particularly relevant or particularly notable for this particular product that's being closed. We then need to obviously, as required by the DIS rules, and looking at good MI is a root cause analysis being undertaken on the back of that to identify indeed if, again, we're not funneling resources where we should do. Another one, again, it will apply across the board, but whether customers are asking repeat questions about the closure of a particular product. So a lot of the time when a product closes, there might be communications potentially going out to customers. There might be some other aspects associated with that, and then there might be some typical sort of frequently asked questions, repeat questions, which are coming through. So as part of Consumer Duty, we're thinking, right, how can we promote good consumer understanding and consumer support? So it might be building out a more effective FAQs page on a website, for example. So that's a sort of practical example about how you might have a product within a firm where there are multiple other products, and some of those are still open, but you're closing a particular one. Another example might be around fair value assessments, and looking at it from a slightly different lens. If we take an insurance sector example, so if we look at the claims handling process, a key question we might want to ask ourselves is, are we providing the same level of service and value during the claims process that was agreed when we first took out the policy? So I think that the question there really needs to be, how can this be monitored on an ongoing basis to see if there is a discrepancy? So you might look at upheld and rejection rates historically versus what they are now. Is there any reason for any discrepancies there? Is it justified, or is it that we aren't, again, providing necessarily the right resources to it, or something along those lines? Again, reviewing service rates against historic practices to see if there's any disconnect there as well. So those are some sort of tangible, practical advice. And I'm sure, again, it's something that we've picked up already, but I just want to reiterate that all of this is being driven by MI and data. It's a really important way of understanding all of this. So a real final sort of consideration and takeaway from a practical examples perspective is making sure that we're tracking the outcomes, using the MI, using effective MI. And if we have, during the process and during our review process of implementing Consumer Duty for closed products, identified that there are historic gaps in MI and data, we should be doing our best to try and plug all of those, because it could really cause a lot of detriment to you reviewing this on an ongoing basis, but to the customers particularly, if other previous practices were done in a certain way and they're now being changed or amended somewhat to the detriment of the customer. So I think if we were to look at those would kind of be some sort of standout practical advice pieces. But again, the key takeaway being that MI piece.
Yeah, those are some really, really good examples, actually, and across a few different sectors as well. But it does just come back to this point around data and management information and being able to track it. I suppose just stepping back and thinking about the implications a little bit here. Karishma, could you take us through a little bit? What are the implications of some of the closed products that are coming into scope, and what does it actually mean for them?
Thanks, Jess. I would say there are a couple of aspects to this. So just to take it a step back, on the positive side, with regards to closed products review, maybe in theory, it should be easier to carry out the review against the outcomes and cross-cutting rules now that open products have been completed and that review has been done. Or should have been done within firms. This should have given a knowledge base that has built up across the firm for this. In particular, firms may find that it's now more streamlined to review closed products, as things like governance structures and processes such as information to consumers and complaints processes and MI production and the data elements for open products, which in some ways could have been related to some of the closed products, especially if they're covered by the same teams, etc., should have been uplifted over the course of last year or the first half of last year. However, I think based on talking to the clients that we have and firms in the industry, firms have still found this a difficult exercise because of, especially what Matt was talking about in terms of older data or data that's, we cannot find the data in the systems are outdated. The traceability issues as well, it seems to be a key issue why were certain decisions made? Like why was this closed? Why were these products closed in the first place? That, especially going back a long time. Another challenge has been to contact clients in the closed product range as well. But this is, again, a wider challenge for firms and not just for closed products. And in some cases, you may find that closed products were loss leaders, so not sustainable to run in the long term. Maybe that it's poor outcomes for the firms themselves. So, and finally, what we may see post-July are maybe things like, say, in the asset management industry, funds being wound down or merged into other funds, clients being moved out into certain share classes or out of share classes, and possibly an increase maybe in preemptive sort of redress payments, for example, where issues may have been found, in particular in relation to price and value.
But I mean, that doesn't paint a very rosy picture. There's a lot of challenges that you've just painted there. And I do want to try and put it back to something a bit positive. And I know maybe, Paul, if you could give us a few strategies to actually look at how to deal with some of these things. So strategies for managing, strategies for reporting on some of these new kind of, the closed products that are coming into scope.
Yes, I think I'm going to talk about, MI comes back in here, but the starting point is this is going to be sector specific. So some it's going to impact some sectors more than others. Firms should have an understanding of what a closed product is, first of all, and they should also have an understanding of what their obligations are and responsibilities are with closed products. Just looking at it in terms of the sort of investment retail side of things, if the starting point is to look at, are you a distributor or manufacturer? So we're of the view that if you're a distributor, well, your obligations are significantly less than a manufacturer. So, for example, the starting point would still be to identify the number and type of closed products that you've got and record this as MI. So you might want to have your own sort of internal mechanism for capturing that. Once you've got that, you can determine what actions the provider is going to take in respect of these identified closed products. And obviously, this closed products has come in a year later because there are challenges around facing providers, and there's going to be quite a lot of providers have a lot of closed products. Once you've done that, you can evaluate whether the provider's actions are going to impact on your responsibilities. So, taking an advisor, if a provider is taking some action, what that might look like is they might actually be contacting the client, but also contacting the advisory firm to say, actually, this product is no longer considered, appropriate and potentially has client harm. So at that point, you then have to consider whether any further action should be taken and what action what that might look like. So, for example, it may be that the advisor, the product manufacturer, contacts the advisor and the advisor recommends a different product or takes some sort of action. But whatever action's taken should be balanced against there being no detriment for the client. One thing to mention as well for distributors, they may actually be a manufacturer as well, because services also come under closed duty products. So, for example, if you've got an ongoing advisor service that you've created and you've removed that service, but you still have some clients within that service, you would be expected to continue to conduct a fair value assessment on that. And in terms of manufacturers, I suppose the starting point is understanding whether you are a manufacturer or a co-manufacturer. And if you're a co-manufacturer, where the liabilities and the agreed obligations lie. So that should be documented in an agreement. And again, the starting point is going to be MI and continuous monitoring. Manufacturers and some co-manufacturers are going to need to review these products on an annual basis, and they're going to have to do a fair value assessment. So it's effectively on an ongoing basis, they're going to have to continually look at these and evidence that they are continue to be appropriate for the market. They're also going to have to take further action where closed products potentially cause consumer harm. And again, this might look like contacting the client or the distributing firm.
That is a lot that we need to look at, and there's a lot of key themes that what you've just talked through that could be pulled into lots of different sectors. So first, understanding the liabilities, where you sit within this, and then looking to identify the number of type of closed products, and then building a series of actions on the back of that, and making sure it's all tracked through back to the data and the MI point, and it's fed up through governance, right to the back of the start of the session today. So that leaves us nicely on then to our Q&A session. And once again, thank you so much. We've had so many questions come in and already been submitted before we even began the webinar, which is amazing. Please do keep them coming through the Q&A section. And if we can't answer them today, we will be following up with everyone post the webinar. So I've got the first one here, and this is back to Paul. So the first one, do you or will you have a templated version for smaller businesses? So this is looking at any templates for smaller businesses, Paul.
The short answer to that is yes, we do. We do have material covering both the board report and closed products for consumer duty. For both of these, the closed products and the board reporting, the starting point again is going to be MI, but there's no specific sort of parameter that the FCA says, right, that is enough for small businesses and that is for larger businesses. It's got to be a judgment that the firm takes, and effectively, again, coming back to it is understanding how much engagement you have to have with these products, because if you're a manufacturer, by default you're going to have more closed products than a distributor, and you're also going to have more obligation to be involved. So many distributors might have somewhat limited role with these products. So again, if that's the case, then it would just be a case of sort of documenting what you do, and again, you might just contact the manufacturer to see what action they're taking, and just be comfortable with that.
As is always the case, it needs to be clear for the business model. It's not an easy thing to just template.
Yeah, absolutely. And you might want to, but that said, you might want to consider your pre and post RDR contract obligations, because some of these legacy contracts, which are now closed, do actually have advisors. The legacy agreement says that the advisor firm will monitor these products on an ongoing basis. And in terms of the board report, effectively what the regulator is looking for is firms self-regulating, so identifying key areas of harm. So proportionality is going to be, appropriate, because larger firms effectively have more clients, so have more chance for consumer harm. So we would expect that the board report would cover similar aspects, but would cover them in different detail. So just giving an example, in terms of if you were to talk about communications testing, an advisory firm with two advisors is likely to conduct potentially a review of their suitability reports and the client-facing documentation, but it might just be a case of going out to the compliance company and asking them for a review, or conducting a sporadic question and answer session with their clients. Whereas a firm with 150 advisors, we would expect much more vigorous testing of suitability reports. So that might look like focus groups. It might look like getting opinion from multiple compliance firms. It might be questionnaires, amongst other things. So effectively, I would say do as much as you feel comfortable.
Got it. Proportionality is key. And I'm moving then into a completely different sector. One for you, Lorraine, specifically on merchant acquirers. So this is from a merchant acquirer that only works with non-retail customers. So this is around demonstrating compliance with the board reporting and other requirements related to consumer duty. Have you got any sort of tips on the merchant acquirer side?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually answer this quite a bit broader than that particular question, because I think whether you're a merchant acquirer, because there's also some questions in there about I'm a small money firm, I do business to business activities. So, how much is it applicable to our type of business, which is a question we get all the time. Now, the proper answer to that is it really depends on your business model, and we would need to look at that very carefully, of course. But I'm sorry to spout some rules here, but just so we're clear, if you look at the FCA's guidance, consumer duty guidance, we look at section 2.17, then that states that really it it depends on the extent of a firm's role and influence over retail customer outcomes. So the level of responsibility depends on what the firm's actual role and influence is in practice, rather than just what it's set out in terms of like maybe contractual terms between the firm and the chain. So it really basically is suggesting that if a firm can determine or materially influence retail customer outcomes, then they need to consider those end customers as part of that distribution chain, whether or not they're actually a direct client of the firm. So what does that mean? So that means that you're going to have to still apply the duty as appropriate. So while the sort of direct impact itself, when you look at it on a sort of face value, might be quite limited, you're going to have to also understand whether in fact you may have some indirect impact, and that can be very subtle, and it's something that's really worthy of a conversation. So like in the payments sector, for example, the duty applies across the whole distribution chain and is likely to apply to all payment service providers in reality, where their activities, as I say, determine or have that material influence over the retail customer outcome. So if you're part of that chain, particularly in payment services, there's at the end of it generally a retail customer, consumer, who, if you do something further up the chain, is likely to impact them at the very end of the chain. So it's one we need to look at carefully, but if I'm generalising, I would say that it more or less applies.
So if you want to know where you sit in the chain, Lorraine's your person. Ask
Absolutely.
her, she'll figure it out for you. All right, so Matt, there's one for you here. So what are the post-implementation reporting requirements or processes which the FCA expect of registered firms? So the post-implementation reporting requirements.
I think it's a really good question. So I think if we look at this from a reg data perspective, so obviously regulated firms on here needing to submit returns to the regulator on a periodic basis. As far as I'm aware and as far as I know, there will be no consumer duty reg data reporting where you'll effectively say to the regulator, this is how we're meeting consumer duty requirements. That's all obviously detailed in the board pack, which you will maintain internally, and if the FCA requests it, you will need to provide it. But what the FCA will do is they'll look at all of your other reporting. So they're going to be looking at your complaints data. They're going to be looking at product sales data, which is I know it's in other sectors at the moment, but it's a big thing coming in for consumer credit lenders at the moment. So they're going to be looking at all of that data, and they're going to be then viewing that in the lens and the context of consumer duty to see if they can identify any potential for poor customer outcomes or anything not being achieved. So I think what is extremely clear is that this obviously needs to be rolled out across the business, and you need to then also make sure that your reporting is accurate and it is reflective of the activities in the business that you're undertaking. So I think that will likely be where the FCA will pick up on deficiencies in consumer duty.
I'm going to come back to you at the end and ask you how many times you said the word data. But I think it's pretty clear throughout this session that needs to be absolutely top notch. We've only got a few minutes left, but I'm keen, Karishma, there's a question for you. So what are the FCA expecting in terms of metrics in this board report versus the next board report? Again, this is back down to data and metrics.
I think we've gone over, the MI expected in terms of what you need to put in this board report. In terms of the next board report, I would say it's a similar metrics. What I would say is by that time, firms should have been collecting data on an ongoing basis. So maybe you will have trends, trend analysis and more deeper insight into some of the actual MI which you've produced at the board report, the Consumer Duty board report. So I wouldn't expect too much difference. But I don't know, Paul, whether you have any further insight into that.
Indeed. I think the first year's board report is, obviously Consumer Duty came in the implementation plan was due in October 2022, which said effectively what firms are going to do for Consumer Duty. So I think it's reasonable to jump back to the implementation plan, which there was a lot of questions within the FCA paper and the final guidance that they presented. So looking at those questions and saying, can we answer those questions appropriately. So it makes sense for me to be the starting point for this year's board report to be the implementation plan, and then within this year's board report you would include an action plan saying how, again touching on sort of these areas that you're not doing so well, saying how we're going to address them. So next year's board report should then effectively answer the questions that were raised by the action plan in this year's board report. That makes sense.
Yeah, that does indeed. You love the actions. We've got the insights, the actions, the data. I think after all of that, we've got a lot of those key points covered. So that is wrapping up. We are pretty much exactly to time on the promised 45 minutes of this kind of lunchtime session. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. Hopefully that was a really useful discussion, and we've been picking out a number of key takeaways throughout. We have our contact details on the screen. We've got some QR codes, we've got our email addresses, so feel free to follow up afterwards. We will, of course, be touching base with people that have posted some questions in as well. So if we didn't get to answer your question today, we will be doing a follow-up. The webinar has also been recorded, so we will pop this online shortly. It will be on our Thistle Initiatives LinkedIn page, so please do follow us there. And that's where all of the updates will be. So thanks again for joining. Have a wonderful rest of the day and hope you enjoy some of the sun.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.